He thought it was just another quiet night in a small town, but everything changed in an instant. A ruthless gang picked the wrong target, and now the real fight begins. Stay until the end to witness the shocking confrontation that no one saw coming. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The small southern town basked in the glow of the setting sun, painting the sky with hues of deep orange and purple. The air was thick with the familiar scents of grilled meat, fresh bread, and coffee drifting from the local diner, whose neon sign flickered against the approaching twilight. The parking lot stretched wide, filled with a mix of motorcycles, battered pickup trucks, and compact cars. A few stray dogs wandered lazily near the trash bins, occasionally sniffing at discarded food wrappers. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was warm and inviting. Families sat in booths chatting over plates of comfort food. Truckers leaned against the counter, sipping coffee from foam cups while exchanging quiet conversations. The low hum of a jukebox playing country music blended with the clatter of plates and the occasional burst of laughter. It was a town where everyone knew everyone, where strangers stood out like misplaced puzzle pieces. A deep, steady hum cut through the evening's rhythm as a sleek black SUV pulled into the lot. Its polished exterior gleamed under the neon lights, contrasting sharply with the dust-covered vehicles around it. The tinted windows concealed the driver's identity, leaving only speculation in its wake. The door opened with a smooth, deliberate motion, and out stepped a man whose presence alone commanded attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, and built with an effortless strength, he moved with a quiet confidence that turned heads. His face, partially shadowed by the evening light, bore the unmistakable marks of discipline: strong jawline, steel-like eyes, and an expression that remained unreadable. The casual gray hoodie and loose athletic pants did little to mask the sheer power he carried with each deliberate step. A few diners turned their heads, recognition flickering in their eyes. No one spoke it aloud, but the realization was there. The man walking toward the entrance was none other than Chuck Norris. He stepped inside, his presence shifting the room's atmosphere without a word. The scent of grilled burgers and fresh coffee wrapped around him, a familiar contrast to the long miles of road behind him. The cashier, a young woman with dark hair tied back in a ponytail, straightened as he approached. "What can I get for you, sir?" she asked, her voice polite but tinged with faint recognition. Chuck's voice was deep yet calm, carrying the weight of someone who rarely needed to repeat himself. "A double cheeseburger, large fries, soda." The girl scribbled down the order, sneaking quick glances at him as if trying to confirm what she already suspected. Behind her, an older cook with graying sideburns and a worn apron paused mid-motion, his eyes flickering toward Chuck with the same curiosity. Chuck paid in cash, pocketing the change without a word before moving to a booth by the window. The seat barely accommodated his broad frame, but he didn't seem to mind. He leaned back slightly, watching the town settle into its usual evening rhythm. The hum of conversation in the diner carried on, the warmth of the setting sun casting long shadows through the glass. For a moment, everything was simple. Outside, however, trouble had already begun to take shape. The first sign of it came as a distant rumbling, low at first, but growing louder with each passing second. The sound was unmistakable, the deep, growling thunder of approaching motorcycles. Heads inside the diner turned toward the windows, curiosity flickering across the faces of those who had lived in this town long enough to recognize the sound. Some exchanged knowing glances. Others stiffened slightly, their postures tightening with unspoken understanding. 6 motorcycles roared into the parking lot, their chrome exteriors gleaming beneath the diner's neon lights. The riders, clad in heavy leather and dark jeans, swung their legs over their seats with a weight that carried intention. Leading them was a man with a shaved head and a thick goatee, his face lined with years of violence and unchecked aggression. His movements were deliberate, each step carrying an air of reckless menace. This was Roy Thunder Henderson, the leader of the Thunder Wolves, a name spoken in town with either reverence or fear, depending on who you asked. His sharp eyes scanned the vehicles in the lot, his scowl deepening as he took in the sight of the black SUV parked neatly among the town's older, dust-covered cars. His crew moved in close behind him, mirroring his posture of barely restrained hostility. Roy's temper was already running hot. They had been thrown out of a bar just a few miles up the road after an altercation with the staff. The night had been cut short, and now he needed an outlet, something or someone to absorb the brunt of his frustration. Then he saw it. The black SUV, sleek and untouched, stood out like an unwanted intruder. The way it sat there, polished and pristine, irritated him. It looked like it didn't belong. It looked like it thought it was better than everything around it. And that alone was reason enough. "That thing's taken up 2 spots," Roy muttered, loud enough for his crew to hear. His voice carried a contempt that deepened the longer he looked at the vehicle. His jaw clenched as he cracked his knuckles. "Some rich prick thinks he owns the place," sneered Pete "Scar" Jenkins, Roy's second in command. His fingers combed through his greasy hair as he chuckled dryly. Roy smirked, his frustration twisting into something meaner, something uglier. He motioned for his crew to follow, his boots crunching against the gravel as they approached the SUV. One of the younger bikers, Danny, hesitated slightly. His eyes flickered toward the diner's windows, his steps slower than the rest. Unlike the others, he had joined the Thunder Wolves more out of necessity than cruelty. He had seen the things they did, and while he hadn't always agreed, he had never tried to stop them either. But tonight, something felt different. Roy pulled a key from his pocket, dragging it along the SUV's polished side. The sharp screech of metal on metal cut through the night, causing heads inside the diner to turn. The few customers near the windows exchanged uncertain glances, but no one moved. They knew better than to interfere. Pete let out a satisfied laugh, following Roy's lead as he delivered a hard kick to the side mirror, sending it clattering to the ground. Another biker, John Nail Thompson, grabbed a loose brick from the lot and hurled it at the windshield. The impact sent a spiderweb of cracks across the glass. "Nice one," Roy barked, amusement lacing his voice. "Come on, don't hold back now." The rest of the crew joined in. Boots slammed against metal. Fists pounded against doors. A trash can was overturned onto the hood. Another biker pulled out a switchblade, stabbing one of the tires with a quick, brutal motion. The air hissed out in protest, a slow, wheezing exhale. Inside the diner, Chuck's order was finally ready. The cashier slid the tray across the counter, but her polite smile faltered when her gaze flicked toward the window. The movement outside had caught her attention. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the register. Chuck picked up his tray and turned toward the booth. Then he paused. His gaze shifted to the window, the flickering neon light reflecting in his eyes. A group of men stood near his SUV. Their movements were too animated. Their laughter was too sharp. At first, he thought nothing of it. People admired cars like his all the time, took photos, whispered about them. But something about their posture, the way they leaned against the hood, the shattered glass reflecting the diner's lights, sent a quiet pulse of recognition through him. He set his tray down. Outside, Roy and his crew basked in their work, their hands resting on their hips as they admired the destruction. Whoever owned this thing better think twice next time. The diner door opened, and the laughter stopped. The moment the diner door swung open, the laughter outside died. The shift in atmosphere was immediate, the kind of silence that only comes when predators realize they are no longer the most dangerous thing in the room. Chuck Norris stepped out into the cool night air, his presence alone enough to send an unspoken ripple through the group. The bikers, still high on the destruction they had wrought, turned slowly toward him, their expressions flickering between amusement and something darker, uncertainty. Roy Thunder Henderson was the first to break the silence. He took a long drag from his cigarette, exhaling the smoke in a slow, measured breath before stepping forward. His boots scraped against the gravel, the sound barely noticeable over the tension that had taken hold of the parking lot. His smirk was forced, but he held on to it with stubborn arrogance. He had spent years building his reputation, making sure that no one looked at him like he wasn't in control. And now some oversized stranger was standing in front of him, looking at him exactly like that. "Something I can help you with, big guy?" Roy asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Chuck didn't answer immediately. His gaze moved across the wreckage of his SUV, the deep scratches running along the side, the shattered glass glinting under the neon lights, the mirror lying in pieces on the pavement. His fingers flexed at his sides, a slow breath filling his lungs before he exhaled. When his eyes lifted back to Roy, they were devoid of amusement. "Who did this?" Chuck's voice was calm, steady. It wasn't a question, it was a challenge. Roy chuckled, exchanging glances with his crew. Pete shifted beside him, the faintest edge of unease creeping into his expression, but he masked it with a smirk. John tapped a boot against the broken glass, his arms crossed over his chest, waiting for something to happen. Danny stood at the back of the group, his shoulders tight, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "That'd be us," Roy said, finally, taking another drag of his cigarette before flicking the butt onto the pavement. He took a step closer, just enough to close the distance slightly, though not enough to be within reach. "You got a problem with that?" For a moment, there was only silence. The diner behind them felt miles away, the parking lot swallowed in a vacuum of tension. A few stragglers had stepped outside, keeping a wary distance, their curiosity warring with self-preservation. No one wanted to be caught in the middle of what was about to happen. Chuck tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You made a mistake," he said simply. Roy let out a sharp bark of laughter, shaking his head as he turned to his crew. "You hear that, boys? Big guy thinks we made a mistake." He looked back at Chuck, amusement fading as he squared his shoulders. "No, pal, the mistake was you thinking you could roll into our town, park your fancy ride like you own the place, and not expect a lesson in respect." Chuck took a slow step forward. His movements weren't rushed, weren't aggressive, but they carried weight. The bikers, for all their bravado, instinctively tensed. Even Roy's cocky stance wavered for half a second before he clenched his jaw and held firm. "I don't need a lesson in respect," Chuck said, "but you do." The shift was immediate. The false amusement on Roy's face twisted into something uglier. His pride, the thing he valued above all else, had been challenged. His fingers twitched toward the chain on his belt, and the moment the tension snapped, he reached for it. Chuck moved first. Before Roy could swing, before he could even register what was happening, Chuck's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist in an iron grip. The force behind it sent a shock through Roy's body, his knees nearly buckling from the sheer strength in the hold. He gritted his teeth, trying to yank his arm free, but Chuck didn't budge. Instead, he twisted Roy's wrist just enough to make him drop the chain. It hit the pavement with a dull clatter. The other bikers reacted on instinct. Pete lunged first, aiming a punch at Chuck's ribs, but Chuck sidestepped, catching Pete's wrist midair and twisting him around in a fluid motion before shoving him backward. Pete stumbled, crashing against John, who had just reached for a crowbar. The impact sent both men sprawling to the ground. John recovered quickly, scrambling to his feet and raising the crowbar high, but Chuck was faster. He stepped into the swing, catching the crowbar before it could land. With a single controlled motion, he ripped it from John's grasp and tossed it aside. John staggered back, his hands aching from the sheer force of the disarmament. Bob, the biggest of the crew, charged from the side, trying to grab Chuck in a bear-like hold. Chuck barely moved. He let Bob get close, then shifted his weight at the last second, using Bob's own momentum against him. A quick twist and a sharp shove sent Bob crashing into the side of a parked truck. The metal dented slightly on impact. One by one, the bikers fell. Danny hadn't moved. He stood frozen, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. He had never seen anything like this. Chuck wasn't just strong. He was methodical, controlled. There was no wasted movement, no hesitation. He wasn't fighting out a rage or recklessness. He was dismantling them, piece by piece. Roy, still held in Chuck's grip, let out a strangled breath as he struggled to break free. His ego, his reputation, everything was unraveling in front of his own men. He let out a snarl, trying to land a knee strike, but Chuck blocked it effortlessly, his grip tightening just enough to remind Roy who was in control. "You had a choice," Chuck said, his tone just as steady as before. "You could have walked away." Roy's breath was ragged. His pride warred with the reality of his situation. His crew was down. The fight was over before it had even truly begun. And the man standing in front of him wasn't just some out-of-town fool. He was something else entirely, something dangerous. Chuck released him with a sharp push, sending Roy stumbling backward. The leader of the Thunder Wolves barely kept himself upright, his face red with fury and humiliation. He clenched his fists, his breathing uneven, but he didn't make another move. The night was silent except for the faint hum of crickets and the distant sound of an engine on the highway. The bystanders, who had gathered near the diner's entrance, stayed frozen in place, as if they had just witnessed something they couldn't quite process. Roy's lip curled. His nostrils flared as he spat onto the pavement. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low, full of venom. Chuck's expression didn't change. "Yes," he said, his voice unwavering. "It is." Roy glared at him for a moment longer, then turned sharply on his heel, motioning for his crew to get up. Pete groaned, clutching his arm, while John rubbed at his bruised ribs. Bob struggled to push himself off the truck, shaking his head in disbelief. One by one, they staggered toward their bikes. Danny hesitated. He looked at Chuck, then at Roy, his jaw tight. Whatever loyalty had bound him to this group had just been fractured beyond repair. He swallowed hard, then took a slow step back, away from the bikers. Roy didn't stop him. He was too consumed with his own defeat to care. Engines roared to life, one after another, filling the night air with a sound that should have been intimidating but now felt hollow. Roy didn't look back as he revved his bike and sped out of the lot, his crew following close behind. The parking lot was silent once more. Chuck exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders before glancing down at his ruined SUV. He had dealt with worse. He turned and walked back into the diner. The neon sign flickered above him. Inside, everyone was staring. Chuck simply picked up his tray, sat back down in his booth, and took a bite of his burger. The night wasn't over yet. The night had settled into an eerie stillness, but Chuck knew better than to believe it would last. He had seen the look in Roy's eyes, the way his pride twisted into something uglier. A man like Roy didn't take humiliation lightly. He wouldn't just walk away and let this go. No, he would come back, and when he did, he wouldn't be alone. Chuck sat in his booth, finishing his meal, but his senses remained sharp, his awareness never leaving the room. The diner had returned to its usual rhythm, but the tension still hung in the air. Conversations were hushed, stolen glances cast toward the door as if expecting trouble to walk back in at any moment. The manager stood behind the counter, wiping a glass with slow, deliberate movements, his eyes flickering toward Chuck every so often. He didn't say anything, but the silent gratitude was there. The town had been afraid of the Thunder Riders for too long, and tonight, for the first time, someone had stood up to them. Danny sat alone at the far end of the diner, his fingers drumming anxiously against the tabletop. He had watched everything unfold outside, had seen the way Chuck took apart the gang like it was nothing. He had spent years thinking Roy and his crew were untouchable, that they were the biggest force in this town. But now he wasn't so sure. He wasn't one of them, not really. He had joined because he thought it meant protection, that it meant something. But after tonight, after seeing how quickly it could all fall apart, he realized he had been nothing more than a follower. He wasn't like them. And now he had a choice to make. The bell above the door jingled. Everyone in the diner stiffened, heads turning in unison, breaths collectively held. But it wasn't Roy. It wasn't the gang. It was the sheriff. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a grizzled face and tired eyes. He stepped inside, the weight of authority settling around him as he took in the scene. His gaze swept over the booths, over the quiet faces, and finally landed on Chuck. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He had already heard. In a town like this, word traveled fast. He exhaled through his nose, rubbing a hand over his jaw before stepping forward, his boots clicking against the tiled floor. He stopped beside Chuck's booth, studying him for a long moment. "You the one who put Roy Henderson on his ass?" His voice was level, unreadable. Chuck took a sip of his drink before answering. "Yes." The sheriff nodded slowly. He glanced toward the window where the remains of Chuck's SUV were still visible. The shattered glass, the deep scratches, the deflated tire. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Hell of a mess," he muttered. Chuck said nothing. The sheriff sighed, shaking his head. "I should be telling you that you should have let the law handle it. Should have called us first." He let the words hang for a moment, as if testing how they sounded in the air. Then he shook his head again. "But we both know that wouldn't have changed much." A murmur passed through the diner. The people inside had lived under Roy's rule for too long to believe that the sheriff could have stopped anything. The sheriff pulled out a toothpick, rolling it between his fingers. "Problem is, Roy's got a long memory and a short temper. He ain't just gonna let this go." His eyes locked onto Chuck's. "He's coming back, and he won't be alone." Chuck nodded. "I know." The sheriff studied him for another long moment, then let out a slow breath. "I can't stop you from handling your business, but if it were me, I'd be careful. He turned slightly, his gaze landing on Danny, who had been doing his best to shrink into the corner. "And I'd pick my company wisely." Danny stiffened. He knew what that meant. He wasn't stupid. The sheriff knew who he ran with, knew he had been standing on the sidelines while his so-called brothers wrecked Chuck's car. And yet, he had also seen Danny hesitate, seen him step away when things turned south. The sheriff turned back to Chuck. "If I were you, I'd get out of town before this turns into something worse." Chuck didn't blink. "I'm not leaving." The sheriff exhaled, rolling his toothpick between his lips. "Didn't think so." He turned toward the door, pausing just before stepping outside. "Good luck." Then he was gone. The diner stayed silent for a long moment after he left. Then, slowly, the murmur of voices returned. Danny swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. He had made a decision, even if he hadn't realized it yet. He wasn't going to be part of what was coming. He had never truly belonged with Roy and the others, and after tonight he wasn't sure he ever could again. He pushed himself up from his seat, hesitated, then walked toward Chuck's booth. Chuck didn't look up immediately, waiting as Danny stood there, shifting from foot to foot. "They're coming," Danny said finally, his voice quiet but urgent. "And this time, they're bringing more." Chuck took another sip of his drink. "I know." Danny exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "It's not just a couple of extra guys, it's the whole crew. Maybe 12, maybe more, and they're bringing weapons this time." He swallowed. Chains, bats, whatever they could get their hands on. Chuck set his cup down. His face didn't change. He had known this was coming. Danny hesitated. You should leave." Chuck looked up at him. "You running?" Danny flinched at the question, shifting his weight uncomfortably. I don't know. Maybe." His hands curled into fists at his sides. I don't want any part of this." Chuck nodded slightly. "Then don't be here when they show up." Danny looked toward the door, toward the night stretching out beyond the diner. Then he looked back at Chuck, something flickering behind his eyes. A decision. "I'll let you know if I hear anything," Danny said finally. Chuck nodded once. Without another word, Danny turned and walked out into the night. The diner was quiet again, the weight of what was coming settling over it like a storm cloud. Chuck didn't move. He sat there, calm, waiting. Because he knew Roy was coming, and this time it wouldn't just be about pride. The night outside the diner had grown darker, the air thick with the weight of something inevitable. Chuck sat in his booth, calm as ever, as he finished the last sip of his drink. The tension inside the diner had settled into something heavier. People spoke in hushed tones, stealing glances toward the window, toward the road, knowing that trouble was coming. The manager wiped his hands on a rag, his movements slow, deliberate, the lines of worry deepening on his face. He knew what everyone else did. This wasn't over. Danny had disappeared into the night, but Chuck had no illusions about what was coming next. The sheriff's warning had been clear, but it hadn't changed anything. Chuck had made his choice. He wasn't leaving. He had faced men like Roy before, men who thought fear was enough to make the world bow to them. But fear was fragile. It only worked until someone decided not to be afraid. The distant growl of engines cut through the silence. It started as a low hum, then grew louder, the sound rolling through the town like an approaching storm. The diners froze, the conversations dying mid-sentence. The manager stiffened behind the counter, his rag twisting in his hands. Someone muttered a curse under their breath. Chuck set his cup down and rose from his seat. The leather of his boots creaked as he moved, slow and deliberate, every motion controlled. He walked toward the door, pushing it open as the bell above it jingled softly. The moment he stepped outside, the tension in the air sharpened. The Thunder Riders had arrived. The parking lot, once quiet and empty, was now filled with the roar of a dozen motorcycles. Their headlights cut through the dark, casting long shadows against the pavement. The riders were clad in leather, their jackets adorned with patches and symbols that marked their allegiance. Some held chains, others gripped baseball bats, their knuckles white with tension. Roy sat at the front, his bike idling beneath him, his fingers flexing over the handlebars. His face was twisted in fury, his pride still raw from the humiliation of earlier. He swung his leg over the bike and stood rolling his shoulders as he stepped forward. The others followed, forming a loose half-circle around Chuck. Chuck didn't move. He stood there, hands loose at his sides, his face unreadable. Roy let out a slow breath through his nose, cracking his knuckles. "I told you this wasn't over," he said, his voice low, dangerous. Chuck said nothing. Roy took another step forward, his boots grinding against the pavement. "You embarrassed me," he growled. "In front of my crew, in front of the whole damn town." His fingers curled into fists. "Now I'm gonna make sure you regret that." One of the bikers, Pete, let out a sharp laugh. "Ain't gonna be so easy this time, old man," he sneered. "You're outnumbered." Chuck exhaled slowly, his gaze sweeping over them, measuring, calculating. "You should have left it alone." Roy's jaw tightened. He nodded once. The first man lunged. Chuck moved like lightning. He sidestepped the wild swing of a baseball bat, his hand snapping out to grab the attacker's wrist. In one fluid motion, he twisted, forcing the biker's own momentum to send him sprawling to the ground. Before the man could recover, Chuck drove a sharp kick into his ribs, sending him skidding across the pavement. Another came at him from the side, swinging a heavy chain. Chuck ducked under the strike, his fist shooting forward in a brutal uppercut that caught the biker under the chin. The man's head snapped back, his body crumbling like a marionette with cut strings. The others hesitated now, the confidence they had carried melting under the reality of what they were facing. But Roy wasn't about to let them back down. "Get him!" he roared. Three charged at once. Chuck pivoted, his movement sharp, efficient. He caught the first man's wrist mid-punch and twisted, sending the biker to his knees with a pained grunt. He turned, ducking a wild swing from another, and drove his elbow into the man's gut. The third attacker managed to land a glancing blow across Chuck's shoulder with a metal pipe, but Chuck barely reacted. He spun, grabbing the pipe before the man could pull away, and yanked him forward into a vicious knee strike to the ribs. Bodies hit the ground. Groans filled the air. The remaining bikers hesitated, their weapons still raised, but their confidence cracked. They had expected an easy fight, had thought sheer numbers would win the night. But Chuck wasn't just some out-of-town fool. Roy stood frozen, his hands trembling at his sides. His crew was down. His best men were on the ground, groaning, some barely moving, and Chuck wasn't even breathing heavy. Chuck took a step toward him. Roy flinched. "You're done," Chuck said. Roy's breathing was ragged. His pride screamed at him to fight, to do something, but every instinct in his body told him otherwise. He had never faced a man like this, never seen someone dismantle his crew so effortlessly. Chuck took another step closer. Roy stumbled back. The remaining bikers didn't wait for him, One by one they scrambled toward their motorcycles, their weapons forgotten on the pavement. Engines roared to life, tires screeching against the asphalt as they sped off into the night, their bravado shattered, their gang in ruins. Roy was the last one left standing. His face was pale, his body tense with the weight of his own failure. Chuck watched him. Roy swallowed hard, his fingers twitching at his sides. Then, without another word, he turned and ran. Chuck let out a slow breath. It was over. The night air was still again. The town was silent, the only sounds the distant hum of the highway and the faint crackle of a broken streetlight. The fight had lasted only minutes, but its impact would last much longer. The diner door creaked open behind him. The manager stepped outside, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. His gaze flickered between the fallen bikers, the scattered weapons, the wreckage of what had once been a gang that had terrorized the town for years. He let out a low whistle. "Well, damn." Chuck didn't respond. The manager let out a breath, shaking his head. "Guess that means we won't be seeing much of them anymore." Chuck nodded. The manager studied him for a moment, then smirked. "Hell of a way to finish a meal." Chuck finally exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "Not the first time." The manager chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, if you ever need a free meal, you got one here." Chuck gave him a small nod. He turned back to the street, his eyes lingering on the empty road where the Thunder Riders had disappeared. For the first time in a long time, the town was free. The night had settled into a heavy silence, the kind that followed after a storm had passed. The parking lot was littered with remnants of the fight, dropped chains, broken bats, and the scuff marks of boots dragged across the pavement. The shattered remains of Chuck's SUV gleamed under the flickering neon lights of the diner, a testament to what had just unfolded. The air was thick with the lingering scent of gasoline and sweat, but the town itself felt different, lighter, as if something that had been pressing down on it for years had finally been lifted. Chuck stood in the middle of the lot, his gaze following the empty road where the Thunder Riders had disappeared. He had no illusions that men like Roy would ever change. They would lick their wounds, maybe regroup somewhere else, but they wouldn't be coming back here. Not after tonight. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, his body still buzzing with the remains of adrenaline. The diner door creaked open behind him. The manager stepped out, hands stuffed into his apron pockets, his gaze sweeping over the scene. His lips pressed together in something close to disbelief as he took it all in. "Didn't think I'd ever see the day," he muttered. Chuck didn't respond. He didn't need to. A few of the diner's customers had stepped outside as well, their cautious eyes flickering between Chuck and the remnants of the fight. They weren't just staring at him, they were seeing him. For the first time in years, they were seeing what it looked like when someone refused to back down. The manager let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You ever think about sticking around? I figure a town could use a guy like you." Chuck glanced toward his ruined SUV. He had no way of driving out tonight, not with the state it was in. He'd have to call a tow, wait for repairs. He could stay, just for a little while. But he knew better than to put down roots. He never did. Before he could respond, another sound caught his attention. The rumble of a single motorcycle approaching from down the road. It wasn't the deep roar of an army returning for revenge, just one, Danny. The young biker pulled into the lot, his movement slower than before, more hesitant. He cut the engine and swung a leg over his bike, but he didn't step forward immediately. Instead, he looked around, taking in the abandoned weapons, the damage, the way the town itself seemed different now. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck. "Guess you didn't need my warning after all," he muttered. Chuck turned to face him fully. "No." Danny let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. He was different now. Chuck could see it in the way he stood, the way he carried himself. He had spent the night wrestling with his choices, deciding which road to take. And now it was clear. He had made his decision. "I'm done," Danny said finally. His voice was steady, even. "With them, with all of it." Chuck studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good." Danny shifted on his feet. He looked at the ground, then back up. "I don't know where to go," he admitted. "Figured I'd just start riding. See where I end up." Chuck reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded bill. He held it out. Danny frowned. "What's this for?" "A head start." Danny hesitated for just a second before taking the money. He didn't even look at it, just clenched it in his fist. He nodded once, a silent understanding passing between them. "Thanks," he said. Chuck didn't respond. He didn't need to. Danny glanced back at his bike, then toward the open road. The night stretched ahead, endless, waiting. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and climbed onto his motorcycle. He didn't look back. The engine rumbled to life, and within seconds he was gone, swallowed by the night. The manager let out another breath, shaking his head. "Kid's got a shot now, didn't before." Chuck didn't answer. The town was quiet again, but not in the way it had been before. It wasn't the quiet of fear, of people keeping their heads down and pretending not to see. It was different now. It was the quiet of something new, something better. Chuck pulled out his phone and dialed the nearest tow service. It would take a while for them to get here, but that was fine. He wasn't in a hurry. The manager stepped closer, offering him a fresh cup of coffee. "On the house," he said simply. Chuck took it, the warmth sinking into his fingers. He took a slow sip, letting the taste settle. It wasn't bad. The neon sign buzzed softly overhead. The town had changed tonight. Whether it realized it yet or not, things wouldn't go back to the way they were. Chuck had done what needed to be done. That was enough. The fight is over, but its impact will last forever. Some battles change more than just one night. They change everything. What do you think about this story? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe for more intense stories like the video, and share it with your friends. See you in the next one.